The Elden Ring DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, is coming out in less than a week, and we're already given a short preview on what the DLC has to offer. And like every single FromSoft DLC, it is going to be a bit of a challenge. That is why I believe it is important to discuss and explore the strongest dedicated build for each stat and attribute. Each of these builds are going to have two setups in which I would recommend, and yes, they're all going to have the same stat allocation. I'm also going to have a top 5 for each setup in a separate video. I would also like to note, these are recommended builds and nothing required. These are here just to have additional firepower in builds that I personally recommend, but go with whatever build you think is the best. In fact, feel free to share what build you plan on playing down below in the comments. But with nothing less to say, let's start off with our first one, which is Strength. With this, I'm going to recommend the two most powerful options, the Starfist and the Rune's Greatsword, and they both play completely different roles. The Starfist lacks reach, but the incredible amount of damage it does, and the poise break potential is incredible. The charge attacks come out fast, and they break poise incredibly quickly, to the point where it can also be a, well, consecutive attack build, which makes it ideal for Millicent's Prosthesis, the Winged Sword Insignia, the Axe Talisman, as well as the Blue Dancer Talisman, and yes, if you can avoid it, it hits the Ritual Sword Talisman. The recommended physique I would say is the Cracked Crystal Tier and the Spiked Crystal Tier. I would recommend this build on a heavy infusion. You could go ahead and throw either Crag Blade or Bloodflame Blade on it, but you could also run it with a Blood Infusion or a Cold Infusion, depending on how you want to run it. And while I recommend using the Crag Blade Ash Ward, you could also use the Endure Ash Ward. Either one, it could be absolutely incredible. The biggest weakness with this build is the limited reach, as well as the fact that it has no zone of control or AoE potential, which is why for the secondary item, I would recommend the Rune's Greatsword. The Rune's Greatsword is great for knocking up and clearing out mobs and enemies with ease. On top of that, it has incredible range. It does much more damage than Vacuum Slice, which is already an incredible Ash. It has a unique heavy that is just absolutely incredible, because when fully charged, it does more poise damage than any other heavy attack in the game, and it gets additional damage. On top of that, it has the same physical AR as a Greatsword on the Heavy Infusion, which is already an incredible weapon, but it has higher magical damage than you could get from any grease. The main weakness of the weapon is the fact that it has a subpar reach, but it's still incredible. And with this build, I would recommend using the Shard of Alexander, the Axe Talisman, the Stargazer Heirloom, and the Ritual Sword Talisman. You can replace the Stargazer Heirloom with the Claw Talisman if you have enough intelligence to run this build, or if you're using Godrick's Great Rune. The recommended physique for this weapon would be the Strength Knot Crystal Tier and the Spiked Cracked Crystal Tier. With these builds, the recommended buff would be a dagger with Golden Vow on it, as well as Exalted Flesh. The overall recommended stat is 50 Vigor, 62 Strength, 17 Mind, 35 Endurance, 11 Intelligence, 10 Faith, 10 Arcane, 10 Dex. You can actually bring all these higher if you want to go past level 125, but I'm showing these as level 125 builds. If you're going a 150 build or something higher, I'd recommend bringing up your Vigor to 60, your Strength to 80, maybe boost up your Faith so you can actually use some of those buff spells. I, however, do not recommend leveling Intelligence beyond 16 because at that point, you got the requirement, don't do it. It's not going to give you that good returns. The next build is going to be Dexterity, and for the most part, it's probably the least promoted one for the DLC, which is a bit of a shame because it is still a very easy build to run, and of course, I absolutely love build variety. But the setup for this one's simple. Bullet, Ashes of War. I already talked about these, they can be incredible. Stormblade and Ice Spear specifically scale best on Dexterity. And yes, these are both hybrids that could go into either a Strength or an Int build depending on which one, but Dexterity is overall the better option. With Stormblade, there's two options I recommend. You can either go a Lightning Grease Keen Knight's Greatsword for higher bullet projectile Ash War damage as well as just more damage overall, as well as a Blood Flame Keen Flamberge. If bleed is possible, go the Flamberge. If bleed's not possible, go the Keen Knight's Greatsword with Lightning Grease on it. The damage on projectile is pretty high, it does considerable amount of damage, and with the weapon strike on it, it can be ridiculous, and for a very little FP cost. The reason for choosing these swords, of course, one has bleed on it, while they both have really long range, great hit detection, and they do an incredible amount of damage for what they do, and they both have decent movesets. Not like you're going to be using it, because hitting with a standard Stormblade, it has about the same motion value as hitting with a regular weapon attack anyways. And that is without considering the bullet. Beyond all of that, it also attacks faster. You can run the same build on a Strength build or with an Agkiba, but this right here maxes out your damage and overall it's just a better setup. With this build, I recommend the Millicent's Prosthesis, Shard of Alexander, the Ritual Sword Talisman, and any of the Winged Sword Insignia Talismans. or Lord of Blood's Exaltation, depending on how fast you can actually proc blood loss. For the Wondrous Physique, it doesn't really matter here as much, but I recommend the Dexterity Knot tier in either the Thorny Crack tier if you're able to get those consecutive attacks off, or the Strength Knot tier for the additional damage. For buffs, I recommend an offhand Lightning Misericord and an Exalted Flesh. If you're running a Knight's Greatsword, you could go ahead and put on your offhand a Sacred Order Ash of War in order to get 10% more damage. Dexterity has another incredibly great Bullet Ash of War that could be absolutely incredible Ice Spear, and this could run on either a Keen Claimant's Harpoon or a Keen Guardian Sword Spear. This effectively turns your Dex build into a wizard, as the best way to increase the damage is to equip the Spellblade set, and you'll be mainly dealing magic damage. This weapon effectively plays as a mid-range option that does incredible damage whenever an enemy gives an opening. And it does very similar damage to the Darkmoon Greatsword, which is one of Intelligent's best setups. It will do less stance damage and will consume FP faster, but you have much better recovery frames. For this build, I recommend a Magic Scorpion Charm, the Shard of Alexander, the Ritual Sword Talisman, and the Carrion Filigreed Crest. For Wondrous Physique, this depends on whether or not you're using Terra Magica or not. If you're using Terra Magica, then go ahead and do the Magic Crystal Crack tier, as well as the Intelligence Knot tier. If you don't need Terra Magica, then do not use the Intelligence Knot tier, use the Dexterity one. You'll get slightly more damage off of it, but not only that, it'll increase your weapon damage as well. With buffs, I recommend using a offhand Lightning Misericord for using Sacred Order, as well as using a Soft Swap Dagger for Golden Vow. For stats, this one's simple: 50 Vigor, 20 Endurance, 20 Mind, 17 Strength, 12 Intelligence, 12 Faith, 10 Arcane, and 63 Dexterity. Yeah, the Dexterity stuff does seem a bit mage-like, but let's look at a real wizard build. Intelligence, which has a lot of variety of what is mostly the same thing, but with some unique skills that can do an incredible amount of damage. But in PvE, the strong of these setups has to be the Darkmoon Greatsword, Comet, Night Comet, and Spiral Shard. Looking at the first setup, the Darkmoon Greatsword, which is incredibly easy to optimize. It does incredible stance damage, and outside of the initial buff, it costs almost 0 FP to use a skill. However, the recovery animation isn't as good as Ice Spear and has a slightly lower overall DPS. When you can actually get it off, it can be absolutely incredible. And it does twice as much stance damage as well, and Ice Spear already does an incredible amount of stance damage. It is probably the second or the best close to mid-range option in the game, and not only that, it can be buffed by the Jellyfish Shield because you're using charge attacks after you use a skill buff. And that is how you get the projectile. You can also just simply get a dagger and put Sacred Order on that in your offhand, and that's just as good. Plus, it benefits from the Spellblade set. For spells, you could always use Terra Magica to buff yourself. Overall, I recommend getting a Godfrey's Icon, a Ritual Sword Talisman, a Magic Scorpion Charm, and a Shard of Alexander. For Wondrous Physique, just get an Intelligence Knot tier, and as well as a Magic Crystal Cracked tier. However, if you want to play a much more mobile approach where you get more movement, more damage, and a bit more versatility, sorceries, specifically Comet, Night Comet, and, well, Spiral Shard can do an incredible amount of damage. And the only reason to choose between each one of these is whether or not the enemy is going to react to it, and whether or not they're a large enemy or small enemy. Comet specifically does the most amount of damage in a single hit, but when you have Spiral Shard, it can tag large enemies multiple times per projectile, and can do an incredible amount of stance damage to those enemies. Felicitas X is somebody who is very weak to this, for example. But Night Comet is essentially cheating because the enemy's AI do not register the projectile, as in to them it's invisible. They don't dodge, they don't react, they don't even know that you're casting a spell. This gives you a reliable option for enemies who dodge, enemies who don't dodge, and it gives you a Giant Slayer option. But if all those options fail, you also got one other option, Rock Slaying, which can be buffed by pretty much anything that buffs physical damage. Because yes, mage-like enemies are usually resistant to magic, like heavily resistant. The overall setup for a level 125 build, I would recommend to do a Lucette Staff and then swap between in your offhand a Meteorite Staff, Staff of Loss, or even a Jellyfish Shield if you have the stats for it. However, if you do not have the stats for the Jellyfish Shield, then just go ahead and offhand a dagger, and then buff yourself with Sacred Order. The recommended setup would be the Mass Grave Talisman, the Graven Skull Talisman, the Magic Scorpion Charm, and the Ritual Sword Talisman. You may replace the Scorpion Charm with the Blue Dancer Charm if you're using Rock Sling, and your weight capacity is low enough. The only buffs I can recommend for this build is going to be Terra Magica if you're using magic damage, as well as a Golden Order dagger, but you might want to use an Exalted Flesh while using Rock Sling. The Wondrous Physiques are still simple enough, the Intelligence Knot tier, and the Magic Cracked tier. The recommended stat allocation for this build is going to be 50 Vigor, 15 Endurance, 25 Mind, 20 Strength, 60 Intelligence, 10 Faith, 10 Arcane, and 14 Dexterity. If you don't want to use a Jellyfish Shield, then you could go ahead and drop the Strength down to 16 so you could use a Darkmoon Greatsword and put those stats into Intelligence. Now we go on to Faith, probably the strongest attribute in the game, with incredibly reliable damage and versatility of every single type. Heck, the only two types of damage it can't do reliably is piercing and strike damage. This dual setup is technically a 2-in-1 because you got the cheese machine itself, the Blasphemous Blade, and the most reliable incants in the game, the Dragon Cult Incantations, which feature 2 Gravestone Steel. But if you don't want to use that, then you could go ahead and use single Gravestone Seal and the Erdtree Seal. The setup for this one is simple. The Blasphemous Blade is notorious for removing mistakes by both the sheer amount of damage and healing it does. It does about the same amount of damage as the Waves of Destruction, but it is fire damage, so more enemies are going to be either immune to it or absolutely resistant to it. However, the entire setup, the fact that it can actually stun lock opponents, it does a solid amount of stance damage from a range, and the value of being able to heal from every single death of an enemy near you is incredible, especially for exploration. Which is why, if you're roaming the world, you might even want to take Taker's Cameo just so you could heal up even more from every single kill. Otherwise, just take a full build of Shard of Alexander, the Great Shield Talisman, Ritual Sword Talisman, and the Erdtree's Favor. The reason why I'm not recommending the Scorpion Charm is if you're going a kind of heal build and you want to be able to tank the damage and survive, it makes it much more forgiving, as the Scorpion Charm actually causes you to take more damage. And with this, at least within the base game, any enemy who's not super resistant to fire pretty much loses. The fact that this thing has such a far range and a fast enough animation that you can already poke with it pretty much means that as long as you're able to get enough time off to use another strike, you're going to be healing back up from it. The only risk that you have is running out of FP, and with that, there's a simple solution. The Dragon Cult Incantations, which can be pretty nasty, as Lightning is probably the best elemental damage type in the game. On top of that, the one-shot potential of this is ridiculous. A good example of this is the damage from Ancient Dragon Lightning Strikes can be terrifying, as in a good position, it can nearly one-shot the Elden Beast Implicitous X, and when a boss is too aggressive to the point where you can't really use his ability or they're too small, then you got another great tool in your hand, Lightning Spear, which is the Faith equivalent of Night Comet because enemies cannot react to it, at least when it's quick cast. You also have the option to set off Frostbite through Frozen Lightning Spear, which can also be an incredible option to maximize your damage. The best way to handle this is 2 Gravestone Seal. However, like I did say, you could just go ahead and go for Erdtree Seal as your primary if you do not have the access to 2 Gravestone Seals. The talisman setup I recommend for this one is going to be both the Canvas Talismans, the Lightning Scorpion Charm, as well as the Ritual Sword Talismans. You can replace one of the Canvas Talismans with the Godfrey Icon if you want to focus on charge cast spells. Now, if you want to do incantations but you want to stick to pyromancies, what I would recommend is just go for Giant's Flame, take the Burno Flame, Catch Flame, replace the Gravestone Seal on the side with the Giant's Flame Seal, and don't forget to swap the Scorpion Charm and Crystal Crack tier to fire. The stat allocation I would recommend for 125 is going to be 50 Vigor, 20 Mind, 15 Endurance, 15 Strength, 20 Dexterity, 10 Intelligence, 64 Faith, and 10 Arcane. Going on to the final build, Arcane, and this is going to be a prominent one for those looking to boost their chances of getting new loot from the DLC. It also has one of the strongest weapons in the game, Mohg's Sacred Spear, along with some of the strongest incant setups in the game through Dragon Communion. Mohg's Sacred Spear, for example, is a bleed-based fire spear that focuses on one thing, a brutal charged Ash of War that does an insane amount of fire damage and stance damage, and it can proc bleed incredibly quickly. The huge caveat here is it does require good positioning, but when it works, it is incredible. The talisman I would recommend for this build is going to be the Fire Scorpion's Charm, the Blood Lord's Exaltation, the Warrior Jar Shard, and the Ritual Sword Talisman. You could pair this alongside the Dragon Communion Seal if you'd like, but the Dragon Communion Seal could work on its own. What makes the Dragon Communion Seal so great is the fact that it weighs nothing, and it is among the 2 best seals in the game in terms of overall scaling. Not only that, Arcane does have low soft cap, so you get to the place you want to go really quickly without having to overlevel. And since the build cannot entirely rely on this weapon, actually it can because it does amazing pierce damage and amazing fire damage, as well as doing a lot of bleed proc, it's actually quite versatile. You may also want to look at putting your stock into more than just Blood and Flame, and that can be where your incantations come in. The Dragon Communion Seal is among the most powerful seals in the game, I've already discussed this, but it could also be power stanced if you have that option. You can also just mix it up with any light or heavy weapon, mix up an occult weapon, and it's still going to be great. But the power you get from the incants, especially of how powerful the Dragon Communion incants are incredible. As, well, first of all, they're all chargeable and they're all considered roar attacks outside of Dragon Maw and Dragon Claw. Because the amount of damage types you get with this, you could actually come up with a plan before fighting every single boss and determine, hey, do I want to do magic, fire, or physical damage? And yes, you could even tap in to do some of the light damage if you want. But what makes them great is the fact that you could go Godfrey Icon, you do the Roar Medallion, and get 2 exclusive multipliers on top of getting 2 seals that weigh effectively nothing, increasing your damage even more so. Which means you could choose between a Scorpion Charm or you could choose between the Blue Dancer Charm, and honestly, they're both just as valid and they both work incredibly well with this build if you want to wear nothing. You could also go ahead and go for the Volk's Canvas Talisman, the Roar Medallion, and the Ritual Sword Talisman. If you're going to go for the incantation route, I recommend getting the Faith Knot tier just so you can get that extra incant power. Otherwise, just go ahead and go for the Strength Knot tier, so your weapon's going to have at least a little bit more AR. For your other Wondrous Physique, just go with whatever buffs the element that you're using the most, which is probably going to be either magic or fire, but you go ahead and go lightning if you're going to be using lightning incantations, but that's more for a dedicated faith build. The stats I recommend for this build is 50 Vigor, 20 Mind, 20 Endurance, 16 Strength, 14 Dexterity, 10 Intelligence, 15 Faith, and 59 Arcane. I hope those were quite informative. Now, I did kind of keep it level capped at level 125, but if you want to go higher, please try to bring your Vigor to about 60 and your main stat to about 80. If you're running a caster build, it might be good to try to boost up your Dexterity to get much more faster animations on your cast so you have better recovery frames. And if you're going pretty much any build, anywhere between 15 to 25 faith is going to be amazing, and you can push it up to 33 if you want to get Howlish Weary. Not sure if I could recommend that one because we don't know what's going to be in the DLC as of yet, but if you want to go ahead and nuke down, go ahead and do so. Alright, thank you guys for watching this far in the video. You guys are awesome. Please consider liking and subscribing. I hope the information I had to offer was useful. Regardless, what do you guys plan on building in the DLC? Go ahead and comment that below, and have an awesome day.